This is Planet America's Fireside Chat. Hello, I'm John Barron.
I'm Chad Ciadello.
This week, we'll talk to the Greens presidential candidate, Howie Hawkins. What does he hope to achieve from this campaign? And what does he say to critics who worry that he could skim votes from Democrats, handing 4 more years to Donald Trump?
The push for police reform following the Black Lives Matter protest has hit a brick wall in the Senate, while Joe Biden climbs to giddy heights in the latest polls.
But first, what could be the start of a deadly second wave of COVID-19 in the United States, or possibly a continuation of the first wave in states that had seemed to have been spared earlier on in the pandemic, seems to be underway. Either way, Chaz, there are some pretty worrying signs out there this week.
There are. Let's kick it off with the only bit of good news you're going to hear for the next few minutes. The daily deaths have continued to flatline and showing no signs of rising as yet. Unfortunately, that is not the case for cases. Yesterday saw 38,390 new cases in one day, which the COVID tracking project has called a record for this pandemic. But by the way, Brazil is even worse at the moment. They're currently over 40,000 cases a day, incredibly. Is that because of all the testing that America has done? That's what Trump's saying.
Sure.
No. America has been hovering around 500,000 tests a day for weeks during a period in which new cases per day have doubled. Although strangely, they've moved from one part of America, those cases, to the other. The Northeast is where COVID kicked off, but now they're doing really well there, as are the Midwest. But the West is not doing so well, and neither is the South. But here's where it gets interesting. You'll note that the South and the Midwest have had a spike from the same time, around 2 weeks after people partied during the Memorial Day weekend. And also, John, 2 weeks after the George Floyd protests. So, which one's the cause? That's the political Rorschach test right there. What are your thoughts, John?
I suspect the truth is probably that neither is responsible, because outdoor events like protests and Memorial Day barbecues and so on, as we understand it, are not the major cause of transmission. It is indoor gathering. So it's probably, yes, a signal was sent because they, in May and then in June, they went to different stages of reopening a lot of these states ahead of the federal guidelines. People not just went out and, party on the streets or protested on the streets, but they also had people into their homes, they reopened businesses and so on. And that, as far as we know, is where this is coming from.
I think you're right. Because let's not forget, they had protests and they had partying in the Northeast as well as the South. And it only seemed to affect the South. I think that one thing the South has that the Northeast doesn't have is they take mask wearing a little less seriously down there. And as gradually people have been opening up a little bit more and going back to normal interactions, I think there's probably less social distancing going on in those areas.
And I think as well, we do tend to think of America as blue states and red states. And this is a pandemic that started in the blue states, the New Yorks, the New Jerseys, the Connecticuts and the Michigans and the Wisconsins and so on. And it's now moved to the red states. But within a lot of these big states like Florida and Texas, these are notionally red states or purple states, but there are blue parts of the state and there are red parts of the state, meaning there are densely populated, left-leaning city dwellers and then sparsely populated conservative Republican red districts in rural counties. And we've still got these divides, which is what, to be fair to the likes of Ron DeSantis, the governor of Florida, and Greg Abbott in Texas, they're dealing with the fact that they have 2 constituencies in their state and they're sort of stuck in between the far left and the far right on this. They're trying to give local authorities the flexibility to say, you know what, you don't have to shut down if you're a bunch of farm counties, but maybe you do have to shut down if you're Houston, Texas. And they've been trying to get this balance right, and clearly they haven't gotten it right, but they've been trying.
Yeah, well, let's look at how they're going with their balance. Unfortunately, it does get worse in this regard. First of all, Arizona, before those 2 states, it's now seen over 3,000 new cases a day, which is a lot for a state with only 7 million people. And 23% of tests now are coming back positive there. That's New York-style numbers. Bear in mind, anything more than 10% is a big problem. Over in Texas, they're now seeing around 6,000 new cases a day, with 11.4% of tests coming back positive. And in Florida, they've got about 5,000 new cases a day, with 14.5% of tests coming back positive. In fact, Florida has been conducting fewer tests while its cases have been shooting up. So Trump's theory definitely doesn't hold up there. But there is one key difference between these states and old New York. New York mismanaged its way to over 5,000 old people dying in nursing homes, whereas Texas and Florida are not making the same mistakes. In Texas, over 65s only account for 15% of new cases, down from 22% back in April, and people under 40 have gone from 32% of their cases to 41% of their cases. In Florida, the median age of new cases has dropped from 65 years old to 35 years old. So that's why there's no death spike at the moment. Young people don't die quite so much from COVID. But let's look at hospitalisations, because they're usually the indicator before deaths. And Arizona hospitalisations for COVID have tripled in the last month. They're now at 88% of their intensive care unit bed capacity. That's getting tight. In Texas, hospitalisations have also tripled in the last month. And in some parts of Texas, ICUs are becoming a real problem.
Mayor of Houston just announced to the city council that ICU capacity is now at 97% in the city. We also learned this week that Texas Children's Hospital is now going to be accepting adult patients.
When they start playing Jenga with ICU beds, you know you've got a problem. Finally, Florida is extremely cagey with its hospital numbers, so we don't know for sure how they're doing. But we do know that they've chosen now to change the way they report ICU bed numbers, only counting the patients who require particularly intensive treatment. You can draw your own conclusions why they might be doing that. By the way, John, it does not end there. California, Georgia, North Carolina, South Carolina, Alabama, Mississippi, all over 1,000 new cases a day. Where does America go from here?
Yeah, well, one of the big concerns, of course, is you talked about the young people coming up a lot in the positive test cases, but Florida has a big elderly population, a lot of retirees there. Arizona does as well. That's the Sun Belt. That's where a lot of older people from the northeast tend to go to retire for the warmth and the dry air and everything else. So you've got vulnerable populations in both of those places. You also have older populations in some of those deep southern states like Alabama as well. Higher African American populations too, and we know demographically a lot more vulnerable. So there's a real concern. You can only hope that in the last 3 to 4 months, after they saw what happened in New York City and the huge rush to get ventilators and personal protective equipment and so on to New York, which thankfully a lot of that wasn't required, that the states are now talking to each other, that the federal government will do its job in terms of liaising between the states and shift those resources around the country now where they need them, so that, you know, eventually we can have hospital ships going from New York down to Florida where needed. That you can actually manage this thing. It doesn't have to be about politics. You can learn from the experience that you've had, and a little bit like we found here in Australia. We benefited from the tyranny of distance, that we saw what was happening elsewhere, and it bought us just 1 or 2 crucial weeks to be able to act fast. But nobody's talking about a second shutdown in the United States right now. And then, of course, you come to the question of, okay, if you're not going to shut down, then you have to shut it off with face masks. And we've talked a lot about how that's been so profoundly politicised as well. That
is true. The one advantage they do have as well is not just they've learnt from each other, hopefully, but on top of that, remember that big rush when New York was going crazy for ventilators and for PPE, for masks, and we said at the time, they're not going to be produced until June. Well, we're in June. Right. So hopefully there's going to be a surge of new PPE and ventilators and all the rest of it that can help some of these states. Fingers crossed. They do need the help though. I'll tell you the real wake-up call. The European Union right now is preparing to institute a travel ban on Americans. They're reversing it from before. And that's a lot of tourist dollars that they're kissing goodbye. So they must be serious. There is a good reason for it though, John. Have a look at this. These are the European new cases per day, and these are America's. And remember, Europe has more people than America as well, so that's even worse. So that's some indication of how serious the situation is. The problem is, it won't be so easy to deal with it, this new spike. As you say, no more lockdowns. There's no way they're doing that. And in fact, you talk about the politicisation of masks. It's hard enough to get anyone to wear masks. Have a look at this.
You literally cannot mandate somebody to wear a mask knowing that that mask is killing people. It literally is killing people. And we the people, are waking up, and we know what citizen's arrest is, because citizen's arrests are already happening, okay? And every single one of you that are obeying the devil's laws are going to be arrested. And you doctor are going to be arrested for crimes against humanity. And then you want to open this meeting with a prayer to God. Are you praying to the devil? Because God is not listening to that prayer. Because all of you are practicing the devil's laws. What happened to Bill Gates? Why is he not in jail? Why is Hillary Clinton not in jail? Why are all of these pedophiles that are demanding you all to listen to their rules, why are they not in jail?
That clip there would be a lot funnier if the situation wasn't so serious.
Yeah, and I'm kind of uncomfortable with the way that clip did get a lot of play on social media this week, because to people who are advocating the wearing of masks, this is somebody who seems kind of crazy, and she's opposing the wearing of masks. But if you listen to what she's actually saying, she's clearly not thinking rationally. She's engaging with conspiracy theories involving Bill Gates and pedophiles and Hillary Clinton and so on. This is somebody who I think probably deserves our sympathy and understanding, and also to know that people who may be struggling, confused, irrational, even suffering from mental illnesses, people suffering from depression, as many Americans are, that this is a time when we should actually be compassionate towards people who otherwise just, seem to be an extreme example of the other side's argument that we can easily kind of set up as a straw man and then knock down.
Look, that's more than fair enough, but I think what these people need more than anything is good information.
Yeah.
And we saw this week that they don't always get good information. At Fauci's hearing this week, he confirmed what we'd all been speculating about until now, which is that early on, they intentionally, including Fauci, downplayed the effectiveness of masks because they thought that they didn't have enough masks for hospital workers. He just admitted it.
Do you now regret not advising people more forcefully to wear masks earlier?
Okay, we're going to play that game. I don't regret that, because let me explain to you what happened. At that time, there was a paucity of equipment that our healthcare providers needed, who put themselves daily in harm's way of taking care of people who are ill. We did not want to divert masks and PPE away from them to be used by the people.
Now, I'm going to back over this because what he's saying, that's fair enough about the fact that they didn't want to divert masks to people who didn't need it as much as hospital workers. But they didn't say that. They said masks aren't effective. That's what they said. Right. They lied. And I don't know how Devil Lady is supposed to get the right information when the person who we're most supposed to trust was lying to America and the world's face rather than just being honest.
Yeah, it's a really important point when it comes down to the faith we have in public health messages in all of this. And ideally, whether it's Fauci or indeed the President of the United States or press secretaries or whoever, you should never lie to the people. First rule, you do not lie. You can omit, at times you omit quite significant, crucial information because you think it is worse to tell people because of the reaction that there will be than to not tell people. So for instance, in the Second World War, Australians did not know about the Brisbane Line. If Japan invades, Northern Australia, see you later, we'll try and win you back someday. That would have been devastating to morale at a time when the Japanese were bombing Darwin and Sydney and Broome and elsewhere. So governments do that from time to time. But you're right, when they tell you something that is false, that's a problem. Now, it would be very interesting to go back over the quite guarded comments that Fauci has been making through all of this, where he was threading a needle between what the president was saying, not being at odds with some of the weird things that were being said about, hydroxychloroquine and all sorts of stuff. When he was urging caution on that or saying it's not, in my recollection, he was often saying, it is not yet time. It is not yet time to be wearing masks. There are questions about their efficacy and so on. And indeed you can raise doubts about, wearing masks often stops me giving it to you if I'm wearing a mask, but it can increase my chances if I'm fiddling with it and so on. And ultimately, if you're talking about, the people who are in New York Public Hospital, the doctors and nurses need it more than you or I do on the streets of Manhattan at that time.
But you're talking about efficacy. I want to draw attention to a recent study about this, which found this much mortality per capita from countries that largely used masks within 15 days of the start of the outbreak. This much mortality for those countries that used masks between 16 and 30 days after the outbreak. And this mortality for those countries that didn't use masks till much later. Pretty big difference there, John.
Yeah, and yes, absolutely.
Might be all the difference.
Absolutely, but the masks weren't there in March and April. The masks are there now in June and July, And they should therefore, you know, this is the chance of Florida and Texas and Arizona and other states to rewrite history, or at least avoid the history of New York and New Jersey and Connecticut. They can be wearing masks now, but they're not. Now, you could argue that those mixed messages from Fauci before and the politicisation, which was maybe muddied by concerns of scarcity, not wanting to create a panic, but still a pretty big issue. Now, President Trump is stepping up his campaign to preserve monuments and statues that have become the target of protesters in the wake of the recent police killings of unarmed black men, including George Floyd and Rayshard Brooks. President Trump is threatening a year in jail for flag burners and expected to unveil an executive order over the weekend bolstering existing penalties for defacing monuments. Take a look.
I think many of the people that are knocking down these statues don't even have any idea what the statue is, what it means, who it is. When they knock down Grant, when they want to knock down Grant, but when they look at certain, now they're looking at Jesus Christ, they're looking at George Washington, they're looking at Abraham Lincoln, Thomas Jefferson. Not going to happen. Not going to happen. Not as long as I'm here.
Okay, Chase, leaving aside Jesus, as to the question about who these statues are, and whether the protesters know who these people really were, well, they may actually have a better idea than most Americans, including the president, as it turns out. Everybody knows George Washington. He was first president of the United States, head of the Revolutionary Army, won the war against the British. He had false teeth made out of wood. But do they also know that he got his first slave at the age of 11 and he kept slaves for 56 years? Washington often spoke of wanting to end slavery, and in his will he did free all of the slaves he owned at the time of his death. But he owned people for half a century. That's a fact. Thomas Jefferson, America's third president, author of the famous words in the Declaration of Independence, "All men are created equal." And he described slavery as execrable commerce and the assemblage of horrors. And yet, good old Tom owned more than 700 slaves over his lifetime, and he had as many as 6 illegitimate children with one of his slaves, Sally Hemings. Maybe that seemed progressive and enlightened in 1820, but fair enough to somebody descended from those slaves 200 years later who does not agree. And finally, Ulysses S. Grant, the general who led the Union Army to victory over the slave Confederate States and later became a president who defended the rights of freed slaves. But even Grant was a slave owner, be it briefly, for just a year or so before the Civil War. Still, Washington, Jefferson and Grant, again not to mention Jesus, are the most convenient historical figures for President Trump to be defending the statues of right now. The reality is, though, most of the monuments being targeted now aren't just slave owners, they were traitors to the United States, generals like Nathan Bedford Forrest. Here's a bust of General Forrest as it still sits in the atrium of the Capitol building in Nashville, Tennessee. As well as being a Confederate general, Forrest was the first Grand Wizard of the Ku Klux Klan. And when did somebody think it was a good idea to put up that bust of the first head of the KKK? 1970. 2 years after a white supremacist shot and killed Martin Luther King just down the road in Memphis, Tennessee. That bust was paid for by a former major supporter of segregationist Alabama Governor George Wallace. The message it sent to black people then and since is pretty darn clear. It was unveiled in 1978, making that bust exactly as historic as this episode of The Gong Show.
Phyllis, what do you think of Have You Got a Nickel?
I don't understand it altogether.
A 0.
I agree with Phyllis Diller. I give that bust a 0. Local activists protested against that bust in the 1970s and ever since. As recently as 2017, the Republican governor of the state, Bill Haslam, tried to remove it and have it put in a museum, but that was blocked by the commission that oversees the Capitol building. That, to my mind, Chaz, a statue or a bust such as Nathan Bedford Forrest belongs in a museum, or probably specifically in the case of Bedford Forrest, I would argue you just put him straight into a skip.
Yeah, look, no arguments from me on that. And by the way, thank you for correcting me on Ulysses S. Grant, because I mentioned him on Wednesday going, why would anyone want to tear him down? I still don't think they should tear him down, but at least I know why now.
Sure.
I wouldn't say they know every statue they tore down. Like they tore down a statue of this guy called Hans Christian Hegg, who was like a complete abolition guy, and he was he's like a bounty hunter, hunting down people who were trying to hunt slaves, and he was doing his best, and they tore him down. And
anyone with a horse and a handlebar moustache, I think, is in the sights at the moment.
And they also tore down the Forward lady. This is like a lady who's staying for progressivism. She's a fictional character. She can't own slaves. She doesn't even exist. They tore her down. Poor Forward lady. Anyway.
I don't know what that was about. All right, efforts in Congress this week to come up with a bipartisan police reform bill kind of went off the rails. The House of Representatives just a few hours ago now passed the Democrat police reform bill, the George Floyd police reform bill as it's now being called, but the Senate really seems in no mood to compromise, so this House bill is not going to get sort of mushed into something in the Senate. They're just backing off now.
Yeah. The Republicans, they introduced a police reform bill, as you say, but Cory Booker and Kamala Harris and Chuck Schumer, they wrote a letter to Republicans listing 5 major flaws in their view, and they said that bill is not salvageable. Only 3 Democrats voted against the filibuster. It's not enough, so it's died. Republican Tim Scott, he wasn't thrilled with that outcome because it was kind of his bill that he was pushing.
Senator Schumer sent a letter telling, I believe it was Senator McConnell, there were 5 things in the legislation that needed to be improved. I said, let's give them the 5 amendments. I sat down with more senators, and they said, wait. There's not just 5, there's 20. I said, how about 20 amendments? And they walked out.
He's a real asset for Republicans, Tim Scott. I mean, leaving aside the fact that he's black, he's an incredibly good performer. And he always comes off as super reasonable. He's very good at this kind of thing. But anyway, I don't think there are as many differences between the Republican and Democrat bill as Democrats would like you to think. I mean, there are some serious differences. Like, for instance, the Democrat bill gets rid of qualified immunity, which, for those who don't know, is essentially it's a legal doctrine where if a cop is charged with something where there isn't a direct precedent already of it being illegal, they get off it. So, for instance, there's a famous case where a cop took a lady who was much, much smaller than him and rammed her into the ground head first. She was in a bikini, she had no weapons, broke her shoulder. There was no exact precedent of that. Got off, no problems. That's how qualified immunity works. Democrats want to get rid of it, Republicans did not. Also, the Democrats want to have a public database, Republicans do not. But essentially, the major differences, when they had, the Democrats banned chokeholds, no-knock raids, racial profiling, national use of force standards, all of those are slightly different to what the Republicans did, but they were just for federal police. They're not the problem. It's the state police that are the issue. And it's not the Democrats' fault or the Republicans' fault. The federal government doesn't have control over the state police. So really, there's a lot of cosmetic differences that people are acting out about in Congress, like they do, which don't make a huge difference. But I'll tell you what could make a huge difference. There's one thing that they could do tomorrow, the federal government, that would revolutionise the police reform situation. Get rid of marijuana drug laws. If you end the war on drugs, you end the no-knock raids that killed Breonna Taylor, because they have no-knock raids for drugs. You end the militarisation of the police because that's about drugs. It's a war on drugs that supplies justifications for many of the car pullovers that police engage in. A study of car pullovers in Kansas from 2003 and 2004, researchers found that black drivers were no more likely than white drivers to be pulled over for clear-cut traffic safety stops, like, say, running a traffic light or speeding, but they were nearly 3 times as likely to be pulled over for pretextual investigatory stops for lame reasons. And during those investigatory stops, black drivers were 5 times as likely as white drivers to be searched. They were also more likely to be handcuffed and threatened with arrest. And look what happened when Washington legalized marijuana. That was the number of white people being pulled over by the cops, and that was the number of black people being pulled over by the cops. The racial gap completely disappeared. That is one thing that they could do at the federal level, which would make such a huge difference for the interactions between the police and black people, I think.
Yeah, and given that a large number of states now are moving to decriminalise or fully legalise recreational as well as medicinal cannabis use, it is kind of this weird quirk of the American system, but the feds are still keen to crack it down on the whole thing. Not so much since old Jeff Sessions popped off, but still, it's a pretty big deal. Now, it's fair to say this was a pretty bad week on the campaign trail for President Donald Trump. First, his rally in Tulsa, Oklahoma was a bit of a flop. The Trump campaign was talking about over 1 million people registered to attend this, a number inflated by a bunch of teenagers and K-pop fans punking them. But they still expected 50 or 60,000 people to show up on the day and fill the 19,000-seat BOK Arena and an outdoor overflow area. In the end, just over 6,000 people showed up. And that has Republicans really worried as well about their convention in August, which has been moved in part from Charlotte, North Carolina to Jacksonville in Florida, about 5 hours to the south. Will supporters stay away over COVID fears there as well? Either way, the flop in Tulsa, Oklahoma could well be about to cost Trump's campaign manager, Brad Parscale, his job, Chaz.
Saying wouldn't be helping him keep that job. But I reckon the seeds of Parscale's troubles might have been sown like a month ago. We've spoken a few times about the Lincoln Project, and they're basically a bunch of never Trumper trolls who run ads almost
Republican
every day.
campaign kind of operatives who've been making attack ads for 40 years.
Yeah, like George Conway is very prominent.
Like Murphy, Rick Wilson, all these people.
And they just go out of the way to get under Trump's skin. They don't care if anyone else watches their ads except for Trump. And about a month ago, they ran this ad here.
Meet Brad Parscale. From dead broke to the man Trump can't win without. Brad was getting rich. How rich? Really rich. But don't tell Donald. He'd wonder how Brad can afford so much. A $2.4 million waterfront house in Fort Lauderdale. 2 Florida condos worth almost $1 million each. He even has his very own yacht. Oh my, Brad's a star. And why not? Brad's worth every dollar. Just ask him.
Okay. Now, you might have seen an ad at the time and thought, why are they running ads about some anonymous little-known Trump drone being rich? Who cares about that? This is why. In the aftermath of that rally just then, Vanity Fair sources said another source of friction has been campaign spending and reports that Trump has gotten that Parscale is making millions of dollars. Did Jared allow this? Trump asked advisors recently. They shoot, they score.
Absolutely. And there's politics within this as well. Brad Parscale ran basically the data engine behind Trump's 2016 campaign, which suddenly looked brilliant in retrospect when he pulled off an unexpected win. Brad is Jared Kushner's guy. Donald Trump and people like Rudy Giuliani would much rather somebody like Corey Lewandowski was back in, or Jason Miller was running the show. So it's whoever replaces Brad, if he goes, is also going to tell us where's Jared right now in the Trump pecking order.
It's such a fascinating phenomenon, the Lincoln Project, because like I said, they run ads every day, and you know where they run? They only run them on Fox News in Washington, DC.
Yeah, right.
They literally just buy ads.
But they get so
just
many shares
for Trump.
on Twitter and Facebook.
I know,
absolutely
but
everywhere.
All they care is that Trump sees the ad. Anyway, talking about Trump's crowds, interesting news coming out of Jacksonville, that convention you're referring to. There was a poll about this, and just this week, and when asked how concerned they were about COVID-19 transmission at the convention, 71% of people in Jacksonville were very or somewhat concerned. Similarly, 61% were very or somewhat concerned about protests and social unrest during the convention. So you might be onto something, John. Those headaches might be continuing about rallies for Trump.
Yeah, indeed. Well, the Democrats announced details of what is being called a scaled-down virtual convention, still in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, but it has been moved from a basketball stadium that has about 17,000 in it to a nearby convention centre, which 2,000 or 3,000 people can fill very handily. It's still going to be a 4-night convention, but it'll be a largely made-for-TV event. We won't get the same backroom stuff going on, and how many people are going to be attending is still to be determined. Meanwhile, Vice President Biden's campaign from the basement seems to be working just fine right now. His lead in the average of national polls has blown out to double digits this week, leading by more than 10 points, 51 to just under 41 to President Trump, according to Real Clear Politics today. That average includes a couple of deeply worrying polls for the president. Yesterday's Siena poll from the New York Times put Joe Biden a stunning 14 points ahead, with Trump slumping to just 36%. That is worse than George McGovern did against Richard Nixon in 1972 when he lost 49 states, Chaz.
Although, when you're talking history, let's not forget Dukakis was ahead by 17 points, I believe, in July 1988 and ended up getting smashed.
Yeah.
I'm not saying that's going to happen, but it's happened before.
It has happened before, although that was one poll immediately post Democrat convention before Republican.
Big
anyway,
bounce,
but yes, look, big things can certainly happen. The crosstabs, though, of that Siena poll would also be setting off alarm bells in the White House today. Biden is winning female voters by 22 points. He's now winning male voters by 3 points. He's winning voters under 50 by massive margins. Trump leads by just 1 point amongst the 50 to 65-year-olds. Older voters, though, and now the over 65s, they've swung to Biden by 2 points. It looks like they're very worried about Trump's handling of the coronavirus. Biden has a 21-point lead amongst independents. That would be the ball game. Pollsters say the picture of Biden that emerges from this survey data is of a broadly acceptable candidate who inspires relatively few strong feelings in either direction. He's seen as very favourably by about a quarter of voters, very unfavourably by a little bit more, but not much. But the majority approve. Trump is more polarising. 27% have a very favourable view, but a whopping 50% very unfavourable. A solid majority disapprove of Donald Trump. That Siena poll also had some state breakdowns that paint a grim picture for President Trump. Biden leads by 11 in Michigan, 11 again in Wisconsin, 10 in Pennsylvania, Florida by 6, Arizona by 7, and the real surprise, North Carolina by 9. Now, Chaz, I feel as though that's probably an outlier because until that poll got fed into the averages, Trump was actually still leading in North Carolina. Now Biden's up by 2, but my goodness, if that happens, North Carolina goes to Biden, then that's it. Donald Trump is a one-term president.
If Biden's ahead by 14 points, I think he's going to win. Yeah. All I would say is that, all I would add is that the disapproval for Trump in that New York Times poll, CNN poll, was for his handling of the protests was 62%, and for his handling of coronavirus was 58%. So there's a two-front war going on with Trump.
Yeah.
And he needs to work out how to at least get approval on one of them.
He still wins on the economy, though.
That's true.
And that's really the only thing, as it has been for 3 years, keeping him above water. But it's not just the Siena poll. Joe Biden is building a big lead in a local Marquette poll in Wisconsin, 8 points in front in what could be the decisive state. Biden up 3 points in that poll from May, Trump down 2. That Marquette poll also found President Trump's support amongst Republicans has dipped. He was at 93 in May. He's at 83 amongst Republicans in June. In Ohio, meanwhile, Biden is 1 point in front of Trump in this week's Q poll. Now, that is not a must-win state for Joe Biden, but it would spell big trouble for any Republican. No Republican's been elected president without winning Ohio. And we've talked quite a bit as well about how well Biden is doing in the polls that measure which candidate cares the most. You had a few of those numbers on Wednesday night. Well, not surprising then that Joe Biden's first official general election ad that came out this week was focusing on how much he cares.
For that's what the presidency is, the duty to care for all of us, not just those who vote for us, but all of us. This job is not about me, it's about you, it's about us.
We are going to be seeing a lot of those kinds of ads from Joe Biden over the next 4 months.
Absolutely. While the president focuses on bringing the economy back, did it before, do it again. This presidential election, of course, is ultimately just between Trump and Biden. And failing some unforeseen circumstances, one of those two is going to be sworn in as America's next president in January of next year. But there are these so-called third-party candidates who sometimes play a pretty big role in determining the outcome. 4 years ago, the Greens Party candidate Jill Stein won more votes than the margin of victory for Trump in several crucial states. And 20 years ago, Ralph Nader may well have cost Al Gore the White House with the vote that he got in places like Florida. This year, some Democrats are really worried that the left-wing Bernie Sanders supporters in particular could say, Joe Biden, too much of a centrist, we're going to defect to the Greens Party. And that Siena poll we looked at earlier had 14% saying they wanted somebody other than Biden or Trump. Well, this week, Union leader Howie Hawkins became the Greens Party presumptive presidential nominee. And he joins us from New York, New York. Howie Hawkins, welcome to Planet America's Fireside Chat, and congratulations on the nomination.
Thank you.
Are you at all concerned, though, with the health and economic impact of the coronavirus pandemic? Many Americans this year may be thinking, you know what, we just can't afford the kind of big structural changes that major action on climate change would involve.
We can't afford not to. I mean, people's incomes have been devastated. They're holding on to what money they got. They're not spending. So investors are not investing. It's too risky. And both of our major parties have this dogmatic blind faith that private enterprise alone is going to pull us out of this hole. That's not going to happen. We need a massive public investment. And that's what the Green New Deal does. It rebuilds all our productive systems so they don't produce carbon emissions and they're powered by clean energy. That'll keep people working for a decade and get the economy right back up.
Howie, looking at your policies, there seems to be a certain amount of overlap with Bernie Sanders. What would you say most separates you from Bernie Sanders?
Foreign and military policy. We want deep cuts in military spending. He didn't really talk much about that. And the nuclear arms race. None of the major party candidates in this country have even mentioned it. And that's something we think should be a top campaign issue. So I think in the field of foreign and military policy, we got a serious program, and Sanders really wasn't addressing that.
And Howie, to what extent do you think your early advocacy more than a decade ago of a Green New Deal had an impact on the likes of Bernie Sanders or Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez?
Well, we know where the Sunrise Movement and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez got it from. Her campaign manager managed the Green candidate's campaign the year before she ran. And he was running on a Green New Deal like Greens have for the last decade. The problem is it went viral. You know, they did the sit-in in Speaker Pelosi's office and the media ate it up. But the problem is the non-binding resolution for a Green New Deal that they submitted when the new session of Congress started took the brand and diluted the content. They excluded a ban on fracking and new fossil fuel infrastructure. And that's like the first demand. If we keep building fossil fuel infrastructure, we'll be locked into decades more of fossil fuel burning. They didn't include cutting the military budget and investing that into the Green New Deal. And they extended the deadline to get to zero to negative greenhouse gas emissions from 2030 to 2050. You don't give politicians a couple of decades to get a job done because they're just going to kick it down the road. So, you know, that's why we're in this race. We want to come back to the full strength Green New Deal we've been talking about the last decade.
Dealing with nuclear arms seems to be quite prominent in your policy platform, and I imagine that's quite popular. Why do you think the two major parties never talk about that?
Because they're both implicated in the nuclear modernization program that was initiated in the Obama administration and continued by the Trump administration. And Russia and China have followed suit. That's why the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists and these 122 nations that agreed to that treaty are scared to death. Both parties are tied to the military-industrial complex, and they don't challenge it. I think that's why they just don't talk about it. And the last bilateral treaty between the United States and Russia on strategic arms expires next February 5th. They're not talking about it. It's insane.
Mr. Hawkins, a number of investigators, including notably Special Counsel Robert Mueller, found that Russia directly helped your 2016 Greens nominee Jill Stein, trying to damage Hillary Clinton and help boost the prospects of Donald Trump. We all saw those images of Jill Stein attending that Russia Today anniversary dinner with Vladimir Putin, Michael Flynn and others. To what extent do you think the Greens Party brand has been damaged by that association?
Well, that picture was inadvertent. I mean, Jill Stein never talked to Putin. He just sat down at the table. They snapped a picture and put it out on the internet. And then people read into it. She was there to deliver a message that both the United States and Russia should cut back on military spending and put the savings into human needs and environmental protection. Unfortunately, that message got lost with that picture, which the Democrats in particular in this country have used to attack the Green Party. And they're obsessed with Russia. I don't think the American people care too much about Russia. We should, because we got to deal with them in terms of this arms race and the climate crisis. So that's what it should be. But this whole thing about the Russians intervening, yeah, they did, but the United States intervenes in countries as well. And that's something we got to stop. We should have a cybersecurity treaty that would stop that. And since the Bush administration and then the Obama administration and the Trump administration, the Russians have offered to negotiate that, and we've refused. So it's not surprising that intelligence services do what intelligence services do. But I think that was a minor factor. It doesn't excuse us escalating a Cold War with Russia. It doesn't excuse Hillary Clinton for losing that race. You know, she didn't offer enough people what they wanted. You know, a lot of people that didn't vote for her, who did vote for Obama, the biggest group stayed home. The next biggest group did vote third party. A very tiny group voted for Trump. The problem was neither candidate got people out to the polls.
What do you say to lefties who basically agree with your policies but worry that because of the electoral system, a vote against Biden is effectively a vote for Trump?
It's better to vote for what you want and make the politicians come to you than to vote for what you don't want and get it. If you are a progressive and you want Medicare for all and you vote for Joe Biden, they don't know you're a progressive. They don't know you want Medicare for all. You just voted for a candidate who's opposed to Medicare for all. So you got to vote for what you want. If you don't vote for what you want, you'll never get it. And the more votes we get, the more leverage we'll have going forward. I got 5% running for the governor of New York in 2014, most for a third party. And we started the Liberty Party back in about 1840 in this state, long history. And it was the most ever for a third party. Governor Cuomo couldn't take us for granted because he'd wanted to run up to vote to get ready to run for president. And after that election, he adopted 3 of our demands, which he had never supported before. And that was a ban on fracking in New York State, a $15 minimum wage, and paid family leave. So that shows if you vote for what you want and we get a good vote, we can't be taken for granted. They got to take us into account, and we'll win some reforms.
Are the Greens doing anything to try to push for constitutional reforms to overhaul the electoral system so that third parties like the Greens could conceivably win the entire election one day?
Yeah, one of the top issues is we want to get rid of the Electoral College and have a ranked choice national popular vote for president. And we've been giving that proven nonpartisan solution to the Democrats since Ralph Nader ran in 2000. And you know, they've had a lot of power in Congress. They've never campaigned for that. Instead, they just try to kick us off the ballot. And we have a solution to the spoiler problem. You know, I hope Joe Biden adopts it, and then he can try to convince people he really means it. But if we're not in the race, that reform isn't even going to be raised.
Howie, what's the biggest misapprehension out there about the Greens?
That we're a bunch of middle-class, old hippie tree huggers. I'm a retired Teamster. My running mate is a truck driver, Angela Walker from South Carolina. And I've been around the socialist movement in this country. It's mostly on campus. They got degrees. They're middle-class folks. A lot of Green Party people are working-class folks. A lot of them are veterans. A lot of them are union members. A lot of them are just hardworking people. So I think that's probably the biggest. When there's commentary about the Greens, they try to dismiss us as a bunch of privileged environmentalists. And the fact is, you know, most people can't afford, it's privilege to think if you elect Biden, you know, it's going to be good. Because like I was talking about, working class life expectancies are declining in this country. They've been declining steadily since 1980. We now have a 21-year life expectancy gap between our richest and poorest counties. Only the privileged can afford the status quo.
The presidential candidate for the Greens Party of America, Howie Hawkins, thank you very much indeed for joining us on the Fireside Chat.
Well, thank you for including me. I guess you're mainstream in Australia. You're doing better than the United States so far.
And that's it for another Fireside Chat. We will see you for another Planet America on ABC TV Wednesday night, 9:30.
And I will be having another pet podcast for you, fresh out of the oven with Dr. Deb Smith right there.
Bye-bye.